Hello, thank you for that welcome. It's my great pleasure to be here. I want to thank everybody from the Congress who's made this possible. And I'm excited to talk to you about effective altruism. So first, let's say, what is effective altruism? Effective altruism is an exciting new movement, new 21st century movement, maybe got going about 2008, 2009. And it's both a social movement and a philosophy in the sense of a way of living, a set of values that guide how you might live. So one of the important things is, what the movement is doing is to try to promote the use of evidence and reason to work out what is the best way to make the world a better place. And how can you individually contribute to making the world a better place? And the movement is trying to encourage more people to make that one of their goals, one of their life goals. Not the only life goal, because we don't think that many people are saints who will dedicate everything they do to making the world a better place. But we think that it should be one of the goals that everybody has, that you want to have a positive impact on the world. But what do we mean by a positive impact? What makes the world better? Well, for that we need to think about values. And the effective altruism movement has some pretty basic values that I hope you would all want to share. One thing is, when we talk about making the world a better place, we really mean the world as a whole. We don't just mean myself, my family. We don't even mean my community or my country. We're really interested in everyone, and not only everyone, even in the sense of every human being. We're interested in reducing suffering. So any being who can suffer, and we know that there are many non-human animals who can suffer, they count as well. So we take this universal perspective, and as I said, we think that suffering is bad. We think that dying prematurely, dying when you have the possibility of a good life ahead of you, is a bad thing, to lose that good life that's ahead of you. And we think that happiness is also a good thing, that it's good that there are people who are living rich, fulfilling, and happy lives. So what I want to do now is to just, in the limited time that I have, say something about three of the ways in which effective altruists have thought and talked and researched about how you might make the world better in accordance with these basic values. So I'm going to start with a way of reducing suffering. One clear fact about this world is that there are some people who are affluent in the sense of having not only being able to meet our basic needs, but having more than we need to meet our basic needs, and able to spend our resources, our money or our time on things that we don't really need, but we enjoy. Some of them you might say are luxuries. And yet in the world there are also many people, the current figure from the World Bank is something like more than 700 million people in the world who don't have enough, who can't meet those basic necessities or can't reliably meet them for themselves and their families. And those are the people who the World Bank classifies as living in extreme poverty. So that's not just poverty that is relative to other people in your country, that is poverty by an absolute standard, an objective standard of not being able to meet those needs for food or shelter or a minimum level of health care. Those are the basic needs we're talking about here. And then the question is, well, what is our responsibility? If by our I mean people who are fortunate enough not to be in that 700 or 800 million people in extreme poverty. And I assume that the fact that you're here listening to me suggests that you are not in extreme poverty by those standards. So what is it that, what is our responsibility for this? Well, many years ago, it's almost frightening to think how many years ago, because it's actually 51 years ago now, I wrote an article called Famine, Affluence and Morality, one of my first publications, in which I used this little story, this little illustration of a child drowning in a shallow pond. And it's become something that's been associated with me. It's been often reprinted and talked about, the drowning child in the shallow pond. What is the point of the story? Well, the story asks you to imagine that you're walking past a pond, maybe in a park. You know that it's a shallow pond, but you see a small child who has fallen into this pond. And the pond, though shallow, and one in which you could easily stand, is too deep for this small child, and the child appears to be in danger of drowning. You look around, you say, this child must have someone looking after them. They're too small to be on their own. Must be parents or a babysitter. But you can't see anybody else around except you and the child. So what do? Your first thought, I hope, is, well, I must jump into the pond and pull out the child. But now imagine that you have another thought, less heroic. I'm wearing my best shoes. I got dressed today for some special event. Maybe I'm giving a talk and I put on nice shoes and decent clothes. And they're going to get ruined if I jump into that shallow, muddy pond, and I'm going to be up for some expense. I'm going to have to buy new ones, and they're quite expensive. So this child isn't really my child. It's not my responsibility. In fact, nobody even asked me to make sure that the child is okay. So what's it got to do with me? I'll just go on my way and forget that I ever saw this child, and I won't have to buy new shoes. Well, what would you think of a person like that? Not very much, I assume. I hope that you would think that it is a terrible person. That's an awful thing to do. Certainly a completely unethical person to put the expense of buying their new shoes ahead of a child's life. How could you do that? Well, if you've had that reaction, as I hope you've acknowledged that you might be responsible for not helping a child. You might be an unethical person for not helping to save a child's life, even though you're not responsible for the child being in that perilous situation. You're not related to the child in any way. It's just that you have the possibility of helping that child, of saving that child's life. Now, if you do think that, then maybe I have bad news for you. You are in that situation of the person with the child in front of them drowning in a pond. Because there are in the world today many children who are dying from preventable poverty-related causes. UNICEF, the United Nations Children's Fund, says that there are about 5 million children dying each year. That's the most recent figures. Now that number has been going down, fortunately, over the years. When I first published my book, The Life You Can Save, in 2009, that figure was 9.8 million. So it's almost half of what it was then. It's going down. But it's still obviously too much. It amounts to nearly 14,000 children dying every day, mostly from preventable poverty-related causes, and that's before their 5th birthday. And you can do something about that. There are organizations that you can donate to, I'll show you one in a moment, that you can donate to that will save children's lives. Maybe not quite for the cost of a pair of shoes, but something you can certainly contribute to. But what the effective altruism movement says is it's really important to contribute in the most effective way you can to get the best value for your money. And this line of thinking owes a lot to this person, Toby Ord, who was a graduate student at Oxford in the early 2000s and He'd actually read that article I mentioned of mine, Famine, Affluence and Morality, and was thinking, how much good could I do in the world? Assuming that I'm going to become an academic, a lecturer, or eventually a professor, how much will I earn, and how much could I donate, and how much good could that do? So he did that calculation. He imagined that he would have that career, that he would live modestly, cover his basic needs, but not spend a lot on luxuries, and that he would have, therefore, a sum to contribute. And he calculated that until, how much he could do each year till he retired. And it naturally came to quite a substantial sum, because he did want to live quite modestly. And then he looked at different ways in which he could donate that. How much good would it do? So one of the things that he looked at was donating to organizations that train guide dogs for people with visual impairments, people who can't see. And that's a good thing to do. It's good that these people can have trained dogs to help them. But in fact, it's quite expensive to train the dog and to train the person to work with the dog. And the result of that is that even donating that substantial sum, he could only help about 50 people to get a guide dog. Well, you might think that's not bad. Helping 50 people to have a guide dog is a good thing. But then he looked at an alternative. And the alternative was treating trachoma. Trachoma is the major cause of preventable blindness in the world. It's a microorganism that gets into the eyes of children, particularly in hot, dusty climates, and where there is a lack of hygiene and good and basic medical care. And slowly, over decades, it destroys their vision. So that you might get this organism in your eye as a child, your vision will slowly blur when you're 20, 30, and maybe when you're in your 40s, you will not be able to see at all. But it's treatable. It's quite easy to prevent this, especially if you treat it at an early age. And it's inexpensive to treat. At the time when Toby looked at these studies, he read an article suggesting that for just $25, you could prevent a child becoming blind. So with that amount of money that he had calculated, he could prevent 80,000 people becoming blind. Basically, a big football stadium full of people. And one person, not a billionaire, just one academic on that kind of salary, could prevent 80,000 people becoming blind. Now, these figures might be questionable, they might change a bit. We pick the low-hanging fruit, so it becomes a little bit more expensive once we've dealt with the most areas where the problem is most concentrated. But still, even if it doesn't cost $25, if it costs $100, that's still 20,000 people that you could save. It's still vastly better than donating to the guide dog organization. And that's an example of why it's so important to look at the evidence and the research and donate where it's been demonstrated to be the best value that you can get for the resources. And the same is true if you don't have money to donate, but you want to volunteer your time or your skills to some organization. Effective altruists say you should look for where you can do the most good. So let's go back to saving lives. It's not as cheap as preventing blindness. This is one of the organizations that is recommended by effective altruists, the Against Malaria Foundation. In these blue bags, you can see that the children are carrying, they're taking home. There are bed nets that will protect them. If they sleep under them, it will protect them against malaria-carrying mosquitoes. And malaria is a major cause of deaths in young children. So studies that have been done of the effectiveness of distributing bed nets, they show that for around $4,500 US, you can save a life. So say it's probably more than most of you have ever paid for a pair of shoes. Certainly is for me, but it's not that much. It's maybe the amount that some people would pay for vacations, or even less than that. So it's an example of how much impact you can have for not huge sums. If you want to know more about that, as I mentioned, I wrote this book, The Life You Can Save. I updated the 2009 edition for a 10th anniversary edition. And if you'd like to know more about this, you can download it absolutely free, either as an ebook or an audiobook from the website, thelifeyoucansave.org. So I'd encourage you to do that and learn more. All right, let's move on to the second area of concern. I've long been concerned about the suffering that we inflict on animals that is completely unnecessary for our well-being and, in fact, often even harmful for our well-being. And I'm focused on the animals we raise for food, because that's where the greatest numbers are and the worst suffering, the most severe suffering. So in terms of numbers, the number of animals that we raise each year for food, raise and kill for food, is around 200 billion animals, and I'm only talking about vertebrate animals here. And I think some invertebrates can clearly feel pain. But if we just focus on vertebrates, birds, mammals, I'm also including fish because they can suffer too, it's this vast number of 200 billion. Hard to imagine. The Earth's population is 8 billion. We're talking about 200 billion animals, and that's only the animals we actually raise for food in farms or in aquaculture, which is an intensive farm underwater. It doesn't count the fish who we take out of the sea, who have lived natural lives, although we then do inflict painful deaths on them. So if we included the fish we take out of the sea, we would be talking probably about 1 trillion animals, though it's difficult to estimate. So this is a vast amount of suffering that we are inflicting on animals, and we don't really need to do it because, in fact, it doesn't increase the amount of food available to humans. But let me show you a little bit about what this actually means to the animals involved. Sorry, I think I've got a little bit ahead of myself in the slides. So that's the slide that I was just talking about and where the figures come from. To show you what it's like for these animals, this is of the land animals, putting aside the fish, the largest number of these are chickens. And if you buy chickens in the supermarket or from a fast food chain, this is how the chicken that you are eating lived. They were never outside. They were in these huge sheds. They were incredibly crowded, as you can see here, just filling the shed, basically. They're fed by these lines that come down, but there is no individual attention to the birds at all. And they are bred to grow extremely fast, which they're very young birds. They're killed at about between 6 and 7 weeks of age. And the reason that I have this quote here from Professor John Webster, a veterinarian and founder of one of the largest centers to study animal welfare in the world, a reason I have this quote is he thinks that the suffering we inflict is not only the fact that they're so crowded and stressed from the crowding, but also that they are bred to grow very fast, to put on weight very fast. They're like enormously obese babies, and their legs are not mature enough, not strong enough to support their weight. So he says that they are in pain for at least the last 2 weeks of their lives because their legs can't really bear their weight properly. It's like forcing somebody with arthritis to stand up all day. And they are forced to stand up all day because what they're standing on is full of their droppings. And their droppings are alkaline, bird droppings are alkaline, and if you were to sit on them with bare skin and any moisture in your skin, you get a burn. You get a caustic burn in your legs. So it's not comfortable for them to stand, but they can't really sit down on that litter for long periods either. Let's look at how your eggs are produced. And here, this is a system of keeping hens in small wire cages to lay eggs. I'm showing you this because this is still the dominant system in Chile, unfortunately. It's prohibited in the European Union to keep hens across the entire European Union, also the United Kingdom, also the state of California, and quite a few other countries. These cages have been phased out or not legal, but unfortunately Chile is lagging behind in those animal welfare standards. If you're thinking of pig production, again, it's extremely intensive. The animals are very crowded. Despite pigs being intelligent, playful animals, it's extremely crowded, and the same kinds of things are happening. And again, this is quite standard here in Chile, this degree of crowding of pigs. Fish, also enormously crowded, and this is clearly stressful to many of the fish as well. Okay, I do need to move on a little faster. One of the things that effective altruists say about the way in which people respond to animal suffering is that we have a bias towards the animals who live with us and whom we love, basically cats and dogs. And that's what this slide shows. If you look at the slide, one slide is about where most of the suffering is, and in fact you can't even really see anything except farmed animals there. The big box is the factory farming. They're just small lines beneath that to represent the suffering of animals in laboratories, the suffering of animals in fur farms, and the sufferings of dogs and cats. It's extremely small compared to this vast mass of suffering of farmed animals. But if you look at the other chart, what it shows is where the money goes. And here the biggest box is the money goes to organizations helping stray dogs and cats and abused dogs and cats, basically shelter organizations. And it's a very small part of it, again down the bottom in that little strip, that goes to animals combating the suffering of farmed animals. So it's completely disproportionate, and if we want to be effective in what we're doing to reduce animal suffering, we should be donating to the animals to the organizations that are helping farmed animals. And again, if you want more details on that, you can go to animalcharityevaluators.org, where they compare and evaluate different organizations helping animals, just as the Life You Can Save, the organization I mentioned before, helps you to find the most effective organizations working to prevent extreme poverty. Now, very briefly, because a lot of the discussion in this conference has been about AI is clearly biased against animals. That's because these chatbots are fed on data from what we humans are producing, and we are biased, and so they reflect that data. They do not really consider animals, and a lot of the ethics statements about AI fail to consider animals. So I did some research with a Hong Kong-based colleague, Tsai-Yip Fai, and we looked at statements, we looked first at courses teaching AI ethics. We looked at 77 courses. How many of them talked about the importance of including animals in consideration of AI? Because AI does have a big impact on animals, including being involved in factory farming, including, of course, self-driving cars, where decisions are made about whether the car will avoid hitting an animal. But none of the courses discussed those ethical issues. We looked at 200 books and articles on AI ethics. We found 7 of them out of 200 that even mentioned the issue of AI's impact on animals. And then we looked at official statements of policies and principles. We looked at 70-something statements of policies and principles on AI ethics. We found just one, a recent document from the Serbian government that does include animals as well as humans among the beings who need to be considered when discussing the ethics of AI. Would be nice if Chile would perhaps become the second country to do that. All right, but very quickly now I'm going to have to talk about how we can, the third area that effective altruists are concerned about, and that is the long-term questions about the risk of human extinction and what we might do about that. To save time, I'm going to skip the next slide. What the effective altruist community holds, as I say, is that suffering matters, and it's not just whether it's present suffering, suffering of people alive now, but future suffering matters too. So we shouldn't discount the future, and the number of beings who may exist in the future if we can avoid the risks of extinction is absolutely immense. You know, our species could exist for millions of years and could perhaps even colonize different planets in the universe eventually. So the number of beings is hard to imagine. Trillions, quadrillions, quintillions could easily exceed that. But there are risks of extinction now. We only exist on this planet, and there are many things that imperil our life. So effective altruists think that this is an important issue to be concerned about, that we should be trying to reduce the risks of extinction. What are those risks? Well, there are quite a few. Nuclear war is an obvious one that we've talked about. A big asteroid colliding with our planet is one that we can perhaps do something about, track these asteroids, and then be concerned about, think about building rockets that could intercept them and deflect them from their course. Those are things we could do. Pandemics, bioterrorism, and a lot of effective altruists are concerned about AI becoming super intelligent and taking us over. That is a possibility. I think a lot depends on when that might happen. Some people think it could happen reasonably soon. Personally, I don't think it's going to be all that soon. I don't think the chatbots who we find amusing to interact with are anywhere close to a super intelligent AI. And if it's only going to be, say, 2070, then I'm not sure that what we're doing now in terms of research in preventing that, in aligning the values of AI with our values, I'm not sure that that's going to be very useful, because there'll be a lot more learnt about how to do that in the next few decades. So I'm going to have to stop at that point. Thanks very much for your attention. I hope I've told you something about effective altruism, and I hope that many of you will think about becoming effective altruists in your lives. Thank you.